Rain had been falling all night, casting the city in a shroud of gray despair. When the county morgue opened in the morning, Dr. Victor Grayson, the pathologist on duty, was surprised to find a group of people already waiting at the doors. Leading them was a short, hollow-cheeked man in his 40s, with a deathly pale face. Beside him stood a woman draped in a black hooded cloak. Her face was hidden, but her hands clutched a black purse, visibly trembling. We came," the man stammered, barely able to form words. "We are the relatives of Elizabeth Ravenswood. Please, cremate her, as soon as possible. She mustn't remain here a minute longer, we beg you." Victor frowned. A strange request. Usually, relatives wanted one last look at the deceased, a final farewell. Some even requested to delay cremation for a few days. But here, it was the opposite. "I understand your concerns," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "But there are procedures we must follow. We're required to conduct a few checks." "No checks are necessary," the woman exclaimed, flinching. Her face remained shrouded by her hood, but there was a palpable fear in her voice. "She must be burned today. Immediately." The man nodded, swallowing with difficulty. "Forgive us," he said, looking directly at Victor. "But please, no one should look at her. No one should approach her body until the cremation." Victor noticed the man's fingers trembling. He couldn't tell if it was grief or fear, but in his eyes was a nervousness, a kind of desperation, as though they feared something beyond human comprehension. "I'll do my best," Victor said slowly, glancing quickly at the woman. "But you have to understand, we need to conduct at least a minimal examination." The man nodded again, his eyes darting to the side, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. There was no one else around, yet he lowered his voice to a barely audible whisper. "If you value your life, don't touch her. Just do what needs to be done and burn her, please. And, for heaven's sake, try to finish before midnight." Victor barely held back a smirk, but something in the man's tense expression kept him from showing it openly. He'd encountered superstitious people who sincerely believed that their dead relatives might return to the world of the living. However, this felt different. There was a suppressed panic emanating from these people, unsettling his thoughts. "All right, I'll do what I can," he concluded. Victor entered the cold storage room. His eyes landed on a steel table covered with a thick black shroud, hiding the body of Elizabeth Ravenswood. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. He'd seen hundreds of bodies in this morgue. Nothing usually fazed him. But something felt off. A quiet, barely audible whisper seemed to come from the far corner of the room. Slowly he approached the table, pulled back the shroud, and froze. Elizabeth's body lay motionless, yet her eyes were wide open, staring unblinkingly, even though they should have closed her eyelids upon death. Those glassy, lifeless eyes were fixed upward, almost as if they were accusing. Victor instinctively stepped back, feeling an icy chill creep through him. Initially, he thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer he looked, the stronger his fear grew. He had the distinct impression that she could see him, that her eyes held something ancient and malevolent. "Burn her, as quickly as possible," he murmured to himself, repeating the strange words of her relatives. Suddenly, a quiet creak echoed behind him. Victor turned sharply and saw that the storage room door, which he was sure he had locked, was now slowly opening. Victor stood motionless, unable to take his eyes off the open door. A rush of cold air swept through the room, bringing with it something unexplainable, chilling him to the bone. He knew a simple draft couldn't unsettle him like this. There was something else at play, something unnatural. Forcing himself to remain calm, he walked over to the door and pushed it closed. Then he heard the whisper again, barely audible, as though it came from the depths of his mind. A whisper uttered a single word that echoed in his head. Hurry. What the? Victor barely kept his panic at bay, glancing back at Elizabeth's body, feeling as though the whisper had come from her. But she lay there as still as before, her eyes glassy and staring at the ceiling. Victor blinked several times, trying to shake off this eerie sensation, telling himself that it was just the result of a stressful day and her relative's strange behavior. But as he looked again at the body, he noticed something unusual. Thin, dark lines began to appear on Elizabeth's pale, almost marble-like skin, as if ancient patterns or symbols were slowly surfacing. They traced the length of her arms and neck, like invisible ink gradually rising from within. Victor swallowed hard. All of this was becoming too strange, even for him. "All right, pull it together," he whispered to himself. "You just need to do your job." He decided to call for his assistant, Andrew, a young orderly who had been working in the morgue for less than a year, but was known for his calm demeanor and pragmatism. Maybe together they could handle this. Victor stepped into the hallway and, to his relief, saw Andrew sitting at the break room table. He entered, trying not to let his unease show. "Andrew, could you give me a hand with Miss Ravenswood's body?" Victor asked, keeping his tone steady. "We need to prepare her for cremation, preferably quickly." Andrew looked up, raising his eyebrows slightly but didn't question it. He had been trained not to interfere in others' business, especially in the morgue. "Of course, Dr. Grayson," he replied and stood. When they returned to the storage room, Victor was prepared for Elizabeth's unsettling appearance. But now, both he and Andrew could see that the dark patterns on her arms and neck had grown even more pronounced, forming something akin to ancient runic symbols. Andrew paled. "Doctor, do you see that?" he whispered, stepping back. "On her skin, it looks like—" "I see it," Victor interrupted, trying to remain calm. "But we don't have time to investigate. Our job is to follow her relative's instructions. We need to take her to the crematorium as quickly as possible." Andrew nodded, still visibly shaken, and helped Victor transfer the body to a gurney. They covered her with a heavy black cloth, hiding the ominous symbols, and made their way to the crematorium in the basement. With each step down the narrow corridors of the basement, the tension within Victor grew. Andrew remained silent, clearly unsettled. When they reached the cremation chamber, Victor noticed that the same pair, Elizabeth's relatives, stood near the door, waiting, motionless and pale. "Have you brought her?" the man asked, his voice barely audible, full of hidden tension. "Yes, as promised," Victor replied, looking into the man's eyes. "Everything is ready for the cremation." The woman, who had been silent until then, took a step forward and spoke, her voice trembling. "Oh, please, do it quickly. We can't bear this curse any longer. We thought it left with her death, but it's coming back, stronger." Victor raised an eyebrow, but refrained from asking questions. This all felt like some kind of nightmare, but he just wanted to get it over with. He nodded at Andrew, who opened the massive door to the cremation chamber. The gurney, with Elizabeth Ravenswood's body rolled inside, and Victor placed his hand on the lever to start the furnace. He turned back to look at the relatives, their faces full of anticipation, and their eyes met. The woman seemed as though she wanted to say something, but merely raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Victor pulled the lever, and the furnace roared to life, the flames gradually engulfing Elizabeth's body. The room became stifling, yet Victor felt another kind of heat, one that had nothing to do with the fire. The silence was suddenly shattered by Andrew's voice, filled with terror. "Doctor, do you see that?" Victor turned toward the viewing glass and froze. Inside, within the flames, Elizabeth's body was not burning. It was rising, slowly and majestically, as though defying death itself. Her eyes opened, staring straight at them through the glass, and that same whisper Victor had heard in the storage room returned. The voice, filled with malice and icy hatred, spoke, "You won't get rid of me that easily." The horrifying whisper echoed through the crematorium. Victor felt cold sweat break out on his forehead as his heart began to pound. Beside him, Andrew stood frozen, his face twisted in horror, his gaze fixed on the furnace where, defying all logic, Elizabeth's body was slowly rising amidst the flames. This can't be," Victor whispered, his voice shaking. Elizabeth's eyes, wide open and filled with sinister resolve, were staring directly at them through the glass. It seemed as though the flames didn't touch her. Instead, they swirled around her, like clouds of smoke that she absorbed as if they were nourishing her. Her mouth opened, and a raspy, unnatural voice, laden with a deep, foreign accent, emerged. "You are all doomed. I've returned to claim what's mine." Victor barely regained his composure, and not taking his eyes off her, turned to her relatives, who stood by the wall, pale and overwhelmed by panic, as if what was happening had gone beyond their worst fears. What is this?" Victor rasped, feeling that he might lose consciousness. The man, bowing his head in what seemed like deep shame, spoke quietly. "We thought that death had taken her. We believed she would rest in peace. But now we understand that she's bound to our family. She is the curse we've been trying to escape. She claims our lives, returning to the world of the living, over and over." "You knew this, and you didn't tell us." Victor felt anger rising within him. "Then why did you bring her here, knowing that she—" The woman raised a trembling hand to stop him. "Please, Dr. Grayson, we had no choice. We were desperate. We thought cremation would free her spirit." But she swallowed, barely holding back tears. "If this doesn't stop her, then nothing will." Victor looked at Andrew. Though terrified, Andrew nodded, as if to say, "We need to see this through." He turned back to the glass. Meanwhile, in the cremation chamber, something unfathomable was occurring. Elizabeth's body had begun to change. Her skin grew dark and shriveled as if the fire was finally consuming her. But then, in an instant, a horrifying grin spread across her face, and a dark, shadowy figure separated from her body. A ghostly silhouette, hazy but no less terrifying. The figure inside the furnace began to move toward the walls, and Victor felt that it was about to break free. "Stop her!" the woman cried, collapsing to her knees. "Do something!" No longer able to simply watch, Victor rushed to the furnace controls and turned the temperature gauge to its maximum, doing everything he could to destroy the dark presence emanating from Elizabeth. Flames filled the chamber, but despite the unbearable heat, the shadowy figure continued to move, slowly reaching out toward the glass. Suddenly, Andrew remembered something left among Elizabeth's belongings by her relatives. He ran toward the door, sprinting back to the room where her things were kept. Victor called after him, "What are you doing, Andrew?" But there was no time for a response. Victor returned his attention to the furnace, praying his efforts would somehow be enough. A few minutes later, Andrew returned, holding an old leather medallion on a thin chain. The medallion looked antique, inscribed with symbols Victor couldn't recognize, but from which emanated a strange sense of ancient power. Her relatives left this among her belongings, Andrew explained, handing the medallion to Victor. They said it was a family relic, but didn't explain its purpose. Victor took the medallion, feeling its cold weight in his hands. He took a step toward the glass, raising it toward the figure behind the glass. Maybe this is what can stop her, he muttered, with little hope. And then something unexpected happened. The shadow within the furnace froze, as though it sensed a threat. It turned its face toward the medallion, and on it was a look of horror mingled with hatred. "No," the figure's piercing voice shattered the silence, echoing across the room. "You can't use that against me." But Victor kept holding the medallion up to the glass, uttering words that seemed to arise within him. "Let this curse touch no living soul. Let it burn away to ashes." Words he had never known slipped from his lips, and with every syllable, the shadow in the furnace seemed more helpless. It began to retreat, its form blurring until at last it vanished entirely, dissolving into the fire. When the figure disappeared, the flames in the chamber died down. Victor and Andrew stood in silence, realizing that this horrifying vision had finally gone. They exchanged glances, and Victor, barely able to believe it was over, exhaled deeply. I think it's over," he whispered, lowering the medallion and looking at what was left of Elizabeth Ravenswood's body. Now it appeared like ordinary remains engulfed by flames, without a trace of those eerie symbols. Elizabeth's relatives, trembling, approached. The man quietly asked, "Is she truly gone?" Victor nodded, unsure of what else to say. He simply returned the medallion to the man, who bowed and slipped it back into his pocket, avoiding Victor's gaze. In silence, they left the morgue, leaving Victor and Andrew alone with the heavy realization, a mystery they never should have touched.